Sarah Martinez had always been different from the other girls at Lincoln High School. While her classmates spent their lunch breaks talking about makeup and boys, she found herself drawn to the ROTC bulletin board in the main hallway. The crisp photos of uniformed cadets standing at attention, the announcement of leadership camps, and the scholarship opportunities all called to something deep inside her. At 17, Sarah stood barely 5 feet 2 inches tall, with a slight frame that made her look younger than her years. Her thick-rimmed glasses often slipped down her nose when she got excited, and her tendency to stutter when nervous didn't help her confidence. Most of her classmates saw her as the quiet bookworm who always sat in the front row, frantically scribbling notes while others passed messages or dozed off. The decision to join the junior ROTC program hadn't been easy. Sarah's mother, Elena, worked double shifts at the local diner to support them both after Sarah's father had left when she was 12. The idea of her daughter pursuing anything military-related terrified Elena, who had grown up hearing stories of war from her own father. But Sarah had saved every penny from her part-time job at the school library to buy the required uniform pieces, and her determination was impossible to ignore. On the first day of ROTC class, Sarah walked nervously toward the gymnasium where the program held its sessions. Her new uniform felt stiff and unfamiliar, the pants slightly too long despite being the smallest size available. She had practiced walking in the black dress shoes for hours the night before, trying to master the confident stride she had seen in military movies. As she approached the girls' locker room to store her backpack, she could hear voices echoing off the metal lockers. The conversation stopped abruptly when she pushed open the heavy door, and she found herself face to face with 3 girls from her chemistry class, Jessica, Amanda, and their leader, Brittany Hoffman. Brittany was everything Sarah wasn't: tall, confident, and effortlessly popular. She came from one of the wealthiest families in town, and her father's position as a city councilman meant she was used to getting her way. The girls had been talking in hushed tones, but now they stared at Sarah with barely concealed amusement. "Well, well, what do we have here?" Brittany said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. She gestured dramatically at Sarah's uniform. "Little Sarah playing dress-up soldier?" Jessica giggled, covering her mouth with perfectly manicured nails. "Oh my God, I can't believe she's actually serious about this military thing. Doesn't she know you have to be tough to be in the Army?" Sarah felt her cheeks burning as she fumbled with her locker combination. Her hands shook slightly, making it even harder to turn the dial to the right numbers. She had hoped to change quickly and get to class without encountering anyone, but fate had other plans. "I think it's sweet," Amanda chimed in with mock sympathy. "It's like watching a kitten try to be a lion. Adorable, but kind of sad, too." Brittany stepped closer, her voice dropping to a whisper that somehow seemed more threatening than if she had been shouting. "Sarah, honey, I'm just looking out for you here. Do you really think someone like you belongs in the military? You can barely speak up in class without turning red. How are you going to give orders to actual soldiers?" The words hit Sarah like physical blows. She had spent weeks building up the courage to join ROTC, imagining herself as a strong leader who could make a difference. But standing there in the locker room, surrounded by the laughter and whispers of her classmates, all of her insecurities came flooding back. "Maybe you should stick to what you're good at," Jessica suggested with false kindness, "like organizing the library books or helping with the school newspaper. Leave the real leadership stuff to people who are actually cut out for it." Sarah finally managed to open her locker, but her hands were shaking so badly that she dropped her backpack. The contents spilled across the floor: notebooks, pens, and the small American flag pin she had bought to wear on her uniform collar. The pin skittered across the tile floor and came to rest near Brittany's expensive sneakers. Brittany looked down at the pin and laughed. "A flag pin? Oh, Sarah, you're really going all out with this fantasy, aren't you?" She kicked the pin away with her foot, sending it sliding under the row of lockers. The three girls gathered their things and headed toward the door, their laughter echoing off the walls. As they reached the exit, Brittany turned back for one final comment. "Just remember, Sarah, wanting something doesn't make you capable of achieving it. Some people are born leaders, and others—" She gestured dismissively at Sarah, who was still kneeling on the floor trying to retrieve her scattered belongings. "Others are born followers. There's no shame in knowing your place." After they left, Sarah remained on her hands and knees, searching for the flag pin under the lockers. When she finally found it, the small metal piece was scratched and dented, but she clutched it tightly in her palm. The weight of their words pressed down on her shoulders like a heavy backpack, and for a moment, she considered walking out of the school entirely and never coming back. But as she sat there on the cold locker room floor, something else began to stir inside her. It wasn't the confidence she had hoped to feel, or the natural leadership abilities she had wished for. Instead, it was something much simpler and potentially more powerful, a stubborn refusal to let other people define her limits. Sarah stood up slowly, brushing the dust off her uniform pants. She pinned the scratched flag to her collar, where it belonged, and checked her reflection in the small mirror mounted on the inside of her locker door. The girl looking back at her still seemed small and uncertain, but there was something new in her eyes, a spark of determination that hadn't been there before. She shouldered her backpack and walked out of the locker room with her chin held slightly higher than when she had entered. The hallway seemed longer than usual, and every step echoed in the empty corridor. Other students were already in their classes, leaving Sarah alone with her thoughts and the echo of cruel laughter still ringing in her ears. When she reached the gymnasium, Instructor Sergeant Williams was already addressing the small group of ROTC students. He was a stern-looking man with graying hair and the kind of posture that spoke of decades in uniform. His eyes swept over the assembled teenagers with the practiced gaze of someone who had seen countless young recruits try and fail to measure up to military standards. Sarah slipped into the back of the group, hoping to blend in and avoid drawing attention to herself. But Sergeant Williams noticed everything, and his gaze lingered on her for a moment longer than the others. She wondered if he could somehow sense her earlier humiliation, if the doubt and embarrassment showed on her face like a neon sign. "Ladies and gentlemen," Sergeant Williams began, his voice carrying easily across the gymnasium, "you have chosen to be here for various reasons. Some of you are here because you think it will look good on college applications. Others are here because your parents made you come. And a few of you are here because you believe you have what it takes to serve your country." He paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. "Over the next few months, you will be tested in ways you cannot imagine. You will discover things about yourselves that you never knew. Some of you will rise to the challenge and find strength you didn't know you possessed. Others will find excuses and quit before the real work begins." Sarah felt as though he was speaking directly to her, and she straightened her shoulders slightly. Around her, the other students shifted restlessly, some looking excited and others appearing already bored with the speech they had probably heard variations of before. "The military doesn't care where you come from, how much money your parents have, or whether you were popular in high school," Sergeant Williams continued. "What matters is what you do when faced with adversity, how you respond when people tell you that you're not good enough, not strong enough, not smart enough. Character isn't built in moments of comfort and praise. It's forged in the fire of challenge and doubt." As if summoned by his words, Sarah could hear faint laughter from the hallway outside the gymnasium. She couldn't be sure, but it sounded like Brittany and her friends, probably on their way to their next class. The timing felt like a cruel joke, a reminder that even as she stood here trying to find her courage, there were people just outside who had already written her off as a failure. The rest of the class passed in a blur of basic information about uniforms, schedules, and expectations. Sarah took careful notes, determined to prove that she belonged here, even if only to herself. When Sergeant Williams dismissed them, she lingered behind, pretending to organize her notebook while the other students filed out. "Martinez!" Sergeant Williams called out as she headed toward the door. "A word." Sarah's heart sank. Had he somehow heard about the locker room incident? Was he going to suggest that she reconsider her decision to join the program? She turned around slowly, preparing herself for another rejection. "Yes, sir?" "You look nervous," he observed, studying her with those sharp eyes. "Second thoughts about being here?" Sarah considered lying, telling him that everything was fine and she was excited about the program. But something about his direct gaze made her want to be honest. "No second thoughts about being here, sir," she said quietly. "But I'm wondering if I'm really cut out for this. Some people think—" She trailed off, not sure how to explain the locker room encounter without sounding like she was making excuses. Sergeant Williams nodded slowly. "Some people think a lot of things, Martinez. Most of them are wrong. The question isn't what other people think about your potential. It's what you're willing to do to prove them wrong." He moved closer, and his voice dropped to a more personal tone. "I've been running this program for 15 years, and I've learned to spot certain types of students. The overconfident ones who think military service will be easy usually wash out in the first month. The ones who are here for the wrong reasons don't last much longer. But the ones who show up scared but determined, those are the ones who surprise everyone, including themselves." Sarah felt something loosen in her chest, though she wasn't sure if it was relief or just the release of tension she had been carrying since the morning. "I'm not going to tell you that this will be easy," Sergeant Williams continued. "You will be challenged physically, mentally, and emotionally. There will be days when you want to quit, when it seems like everyone else is stronger, faster, or more naturally suited for leadership. But if you're willing to put in the work and push through those moments of doubt, you might discover that you're capable of more than anyone expects, including yourself." As Sarah walked home that afternoon, the scratched flag pin catching the light on her collar, she thought about Sergeant Williams' words. The laughter from the locker room still echoed in her memory, but it was gradually being replaced by something else, a quiet determination to prove that being underestimated might actually be her greatest advantage. She didn't know then that this was just the beginning of a journey that would take her far beyond the hallways of Lincoln High School, or that the three girls who had mocked her in the locker room would one day see her name in the newspaper for reasons they could never have imagined. All she knew was that tomorrow, she would put on her uniform again, pin that scratched flag to her collar, and show up ready to do the work. 3 years had passed since that humiliating day in the locker room, and Sarah Martinez was no longer the uncertain girl who had been mocked for her military aspirations. She stood in the dining facility at Fort Bragg, her Army combat uniform crisp and bearing the chevrons of a staff sergeant, watching the newest group of recruits fumble through their first meal in the military. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. After graduating from Lincoln High School with honors and a full ROTC scholarship to State University, Sarah had thrown herself into military science courses with the same determination that had carried her through those difficult early days in the program. Sergeant Williams had been right. She did possess an inner strength that surprised everyone, including herself. College had brought its own challenges. Sarah's roommate, Kelly, was a sorority girl who couldn't understand why anyone would choose to wake up at 5 in the morning for physical training when they could be sleeping off the previous night's party. The other ROTC cadets were mostly male, and many of them had grown up in military families, giving them a confidence and familiarity with military culture that Sarah had to work twice as hard to develop. But work hard she did. While her classmates complained about the demands of military science courses, Sarah excelled. She studied tactics and strategy with the intensity of a scholar, memorizing field manuals and practicing drill commands until they became second nature. Her small frame, which had once been a source of mockery, proved to be an advantage during long ruck marches where endurance mattered more than raw strength. The real test came during advanced camp at Fort Knox, where college ROTC cadets from across the country gathered for a month of intense training designed to separate future officers from those who weren't cut out for military leadership. Sarah arrived at camp knowing that she would be evaluated on everything from her ability to lead a squad through combat scenarios to her performance during survival exercises. On the first day, she was assigned to a squad that included Marcus Thompson, a football player from a military academy who had made it clear that he didn't think women belonged in combat roles. He towered over Sarah by more than a foot and had the kind of natural charisma that made other cadets gravitate toward him during informal gatherings. "Great," Marcus had muttered when he saw the roster. "They stuck us with Martinez. Hope she doesn't slow us down when we're out there playing war games." His comment had stung, but Sarah had learned to channel that kind of dismissiveness into fuel for her determination. She had also learned that the best response to doubt was competent action rather than defensive words. The first major exercise was a night infiltration mission where each squad had to navigate through enemy territory, gather intelligence from a target building, and return to base without being detected by the cadre members playing the role of opposing forces. Sarah volunteered to take point, despite Marcus's obvious reluctance to follow a female squad leader. Moving through the dark forest with night vision goggles, Sarah drew on everything she had learned about tactics and terrain navigation. She led her squad through a route that avoided the obvious patrol paths, using natural cover and moving during periods when the enemy sentries were changing shifts. When they reached the target building, she coordinated a perfect extraction of the required intelligence while Marcus and the others provided security. The mission was completed flawlessly, and their squad received the highest marks of the exercise. Marcus grudgingly admitted that Sarah knew what she was doing, and word spread through the camp that the small girl from the Midwest wasn't someone to underestimate. But the real defining moment came during the final leadership exercise, when Sarah was placed in command of a platoon tasked with defending a strategic position against a much larger attacking force. The scenario was designed to test how future officers would handle overwhelming odds and make difficult decisions under pressure. As the exercise began, Sarah quickly realized that a conventional defense would fail against the superior numbers they were facing. Instead, she divided her platoon into smaller teams and implemented a series of hit-and-run tactics, using the terrain to her advantage and forcing the attacking force to spread out and lose coordination. The strategy worked brilliantly. By the time the exercise ended, Sarah's platoon had inflicted heavy casualties on the attacking force while suffering minimal losses themselves. The cadre members evaluating the exercise were impressed enough to use her tactics as an example for future classes. When advanced camp concluded, Sarah ranked in the top 5% of all participants. More importantly, she had earned the respect of her peers and the attention of the cadre members who would write her officer evaluation reports. Marcus Thompson approached her on the last day of camp with an expression she had never seen on his face before: genuine respect. "Martinez," he said, extending his hand, "I owe you an apology. I was wrong about you. You're going to make an outstanding officer." After being commissioned as a second lieutenant upon graduation from college, Sarah was assigned to Fort Bragg and quickly established herself as a rising star in her unit. Her attention to detail, innovative thinking, and genuine care for her soldiers set her apart from her peers. She volunteered for every challenging assignment and deployed twice to Afghanistan, where she led her platoon through some of the most dangerous missions in the theater. During her second deployment, Sarah's convoy was ambushed while conducting a supply run to a forward operating base. The lead vehicle hit an improvised explosive device, and small arms fire erupted from multiple positions along the road. In the chaos that followed, Sarah kept her cool and coordinated a response that saved lives and drove off the attackers. Her actions that day earned her a Bronze Star with V device for valor, but more importantly, they solidified her reputation as the kind of officer that soldiers wanted to follow into battle. Stories of her courage and tactical acumen spread through the military community, and she began receiving offers for prestigious assignments that were usually reserved for officers with much more experience. Back at Fort Bragg between deployments, Sarah threw herself into her duties with the same intensity she had brought to everything else in her military career. She was promoted to first lieutenant ahead of schedule and then to captain 2 years early. Her efficiency reports consistently rated her as the top officer in her peer group, and her battalion commander began grooming her for positions of greater responsibility. It was during this period that Sarah received a call that would change everything. General Patricia Morrison, one of the highest-ranking women in the Army, had heard about Sarah's performance and wanted to meet with her about a special opportunity. Sarah drove to the general's office with a mixture of excitement and nervousness, wondering what kind of assignment could require the personal attention of such a senior officer. General Morrison was a legend in military circles, a pioneer who had broken barriers and opened doors for the women who followed her. She had commanded at every level from company to division, and was known for her strategic brilliance and unwavering integrity. Meeting her was like sitting across from a living piece of military history. "Captain Martinez," General Morrison began after the initial pleasantries. "I've been following your career with great interest. Your performance in Afghanistan, your leadership ratings, and your innovative approaches to complex problems have caught the attention of people at very high levels." Sarah sat straighter in her chair, unsure where this conversation was heading, but sensing that it was important beyond anything she had previously experienced. "The Army is changing," the general continued. "We're opening new roles to women, expanding opportunities, and looking for officers who can serve as examples of what's possible when talent and determination meet opportunity. I believe you could be one of those officers, but it would require taking on challenges that go far beyond anything you've faced so far." General Morrison explained that Sarah was being considered for a newly created position, command of a mixed-gender combat unit that would serve as a proving ground for full integration of women into previously restricted roles. It was a high-visibility assignment that came with tremendous opportunities, but also enormous risks. Success could catapult Sarah's career to heights few officers ever reached. Failure would be equally public and potentially career-ending. "I won't lie to you, Captain," General Morrison said. "There will be people rooting for you to fail. Some of them will be in your own chain of command. The media will be watching everything you do, waiting for mistakes they can use to argue against women in combat roles. You'll face scrutiny and pressure that male officers in similar positions never experience." Sarah thought about the long journey that had brought her to this moment. The laughter in the locker room seemed like it had happened to a different person, but she could still remember the feeling of being dismissed and underestimated. Now she was being offered the chance to prove not just her own capabilities, but the potential of every woman who had been told she didn't belong in uniform. "General, I understand the challenges," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what was being offered. "But I also understand the opportunity. If I don't take this assignment, someone else will, and they might not be as prepared for the fight that comes with it. I've been preparing for this my entire career, even when I didn't know what this was going to be." General Morrison smiled for the first time during their meeting. "I hoped you would say that. The command is yours, effective immediately upon your promotion to Major. Congratulations, Major Martinez. Don't make me regret this recommendation." As Sarah drove back to her quarters that evening, she thought about calling her mother to share the news. Elena had worried about her daughter's military career from the beginning, but she had also been Sarah's biggest supporter through every challenge and triumph. Sarah's father had never bothered to attend her commissioning ceremony or acknowledge her military achievements, but her mother had been there for every promotion and award. She also thought about Brittany, Jessica, and Amanda, the three girls whose cruel laughter had once made her question her own worth. She wondered what they were doing now, whether they had achieved their own dreams or settled for smaller ambitions. Not that it mattered anymore. Their opinions had lost their power over her long ago, replaced by the respect she had earned from people whose judgment actually counted. The scratched flag pin from high school still sat in Sarah's jewelry box, a reminder of how far she had come. Tomorrow, she would put on her major's oak leaves for the first time and begin preparing for a command that would test everything she had learned about leadership, courage, and perseverance. She had no way of knowing that within 2 years, she would be standing in front of those same high school classmates at their 10-year reunion, wearing the uniform of a lieutenant colonel and representing everything they had once believed was impossible. But that moment was still in the future. For now, she was simply Major Sarah Martinez, preparing to prove once again that being underestimated was just another obstacle to overcome. The invitation had arrived at Sarah's office at the Pentagon on a Tuesday morning that felt like any other. Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Martinez, now 32 years old and serving as a strategic planning officer for the Joint Chiefs of Staff, had been deep in a briefing document about Middle Eastern operations when her aide knocked on her door with the day's mail. Among the official correspondence and military publications was a colorful envelope that looked distinctly out of place in the serious atmosphere of her office. The return address made her pause. Lincoln High School Class of 2010 Reunion Committee. Sarah stared at the envelope for a long moment before opening it, memories of her high school years flooding back with surprising intensity. The invitation was elaborate, printed on heavy cardstock with gold lettering announcing the 15-year class reunion. There would be a cocktail reception, dinner, dancing, and a memorial service for classmates who had passed away. The committee had clearly put considerable effort into making it a memorable event, complete with a photographer and a slideshow of yearbook photos. Sarah's first instinct was to throw the invitation away. She had built a successful life that had nothing to do with Lincoln High School or the people who had made those years difficult for her. Why should she waste a weekend revisiting a time when she had felt small and powerless? She had more important things to do than make small talk with people who had ignored or mocked her 15 years ago. But as she started to toss the invitation into her trash bin, something made her hesitate. Maybe it was curiosity about how her former classmates had turned out, or perhaps it was a desire to put that chapter of her life to rest once and for all. Whatever the reason, she found herself setting the invitation aside and making a mental note to consider attending. The decision became easier when she called her mother that evening to tell her about the invitation. Elena was now in her early 60s and still working at the diner, though she owned it now after the previous owner had retired and offered her the chance to buy the business. She had followed every step of Sarah's military career with fierce pride, keeping newspaper clippings of her daughter's promotions and achievements in a scrapbook that she showed to anyone who would listen. "Mija, you should absolutely go," Elena said without hesitation. "Those people need to see what you've become, not for their sake, but for yours. You've spent 15 years proving them wrong. Now let them see the proof." Sarah knew her mother was right, but she also felt a familiar flutter of anxiety at the thought of facing her former classmates. She had commanded soldiers in combat, briefed generals at the Pentagon, and testified before congressional committees, but the idea of walking into her high school gymnasium and facing Brittany Hoffman still made her stomach tighten. Over the next few weeks, Sarah found herself researching her former classmates on social media, something she had never bothered to do before. The results were both fascinating and predictable. Many of them had settled into conventional suburban lives with spouses, children, and jobs that seemed perfectly ordinary. Others had struggled with various challenges, failed marriages, financial difficulties, or health problems. Brittany Hoffman, Now Brittany Patterson had married her high school boyfriend and moved to a suburb outside the city. Her social media posts showed a woman who appeared to be living a comfortable but unremarkable life, posting pictures of family vacations and complaining about the challenges of managing 3 children and a part-time real estate career. There was no trace of the cruel confidence that had once made her seem so powerful and intimidating. Jessica and Amanda had both remained in the local area as well. Jessica worked as a dental hygienist and seemed to spend most of her free time organizing charity events for her church. Amanda had become a teacher at the elementary school and appeared to genuinely love working with children. Neither of them seemed particularly happy or unhappy, just ordinary people living ordinary lives. As Sarah read their posts and looked at their photos, she felt something unexpected, an absence of any strong emotion at all. These women who had once seemed so important, whose opinions had carried such weight in her adolescent mind, were now just strangers whose lives had intersected with hers briefly 15 years ago. The power they had once held over her had evaporated completely, leaving behind only mild curiosity about how different their paths had been. The weekend of the reunion, Sarah flew back to her hometown and checked into a hotel near the school. She had brought 2 outfits, a simple black dress for the social events and her dress blue uniform for the memorial service, where she had been asked to speak about her former classmate, Tommy Rodriguez, who had been killed in Iraq during his 2nd deployment. Sarah spent Saturday afternoon walking around the town where she had grown up, noting the changes and similarities. The diner where her mother had worked for so many years was thriving under Elena's ownership, and she stopped by for lunch. Several of the older customers recognized her and wanted to hear about her military career, treating her like a local celebrity who had made good. That evening, Sarah stood in front of the hotel mirror, adjusting the ribbons and medals on her dress blue uniform. She had earned each decoration through years of service, sacrifice, and achievement. The bronze star with V device was prominently displayed, along with her meritorious service medals, Army commendation medals, and various campaign ribbons from her deployments. The lieutenant colonel's silver oak leaves on her shoulders caught the light as she turned to check her appearance. She thought about the 17-year-old girl who had been humiliated in the locker room all those years ago. That girl could never have imagined standing here today, wearing the uniform of a field-grade officer and preparing to address her former classmates as a successful military leader. The journey from that frightened teenager to this confident woman had been marked by countless moments of doubt, determination, and growth. The reunion was being held in the school gymnasium, the same space where she had attended her first ROTC class with Sergeant Williams. As Sarah walked through the entrance, she was struck by how much smaller everything seemed than it had in her memories. The hallways that had once felt endless now seemed narrow and cramped. The locker room where she had been mocked was just an ordinary space with no special power to intimidate or humiliate. The gymnasium had been decorated with balloons and banners in the school colors, and round tables filled the space where basketball games had once been played. A registration table near the entrance was staffed by reunion committee volunteers who were checking names against their lists and handing out name tags with yearbook photos attached. Sarah approached the table with a mixture of amusement and curiosity, wondering if anyone would recognize her. The volunteer at the table, a woman she vaguely remembered from her biology class, looked up with a professional smile that faltered slightly when she saw Sarah's uniform. "Name, please?" the woman asked, clearly trying to place Sarah's face. "Sarah Martinez," she replied, watching as the woman's eyes widened in recognition. "Oh my God, Sarah Martinez! I can't believe it's really you!" The woman's voice carried across the space, causing several other attendees to turn and look in their direction. "You look absolutely amazing. And you're in the military. I had no idea." Sarah accepted her name tag with a polite smile, noting that her yearbook photo showed a serious-looking teenager with glasses who bore only a passing resemblance to the confident woman she had become. As she pinned the tag to her uniform jacket, she could feel eyes on her from across the room. The evening progressed much as she had expected. Former classmates approached her with expressions of surprise and curiosity, asking about her military career and sharing updates about their own lives. Most of them seemed genuinely impressed by her achievements, though Sarah could sense an undercurrent of disbelief in some of their responses, as if they couldn't quite reconcile the successful officer standing before them with their memories of the quiet girl who had once sat in the back of their classes. Marcus Thompson was there, now working as a high school football coach in a neighboring district. He greeted Sarah with genuine warmth and spent several minutes telling anyone who would listen about their time together at advanced camp and how Sarah had been one of the most competent officers he had ever served with. His endorsement carried weight with their former classmates, many of whom remembered his prominence as a high school athlete. Sarah was making conversation with a group of former classmates when she noticed Brittany approaching from across the room. 15 years had softened Brittany's sharp edges somewhat, and she carried herself with less of the commanding presence that had once made her seem so formidable. She was still attractive and well-dressed, but there was something tentative in her manner as she joined the conversation. "Sarah, wow, I hardly recognized you," Brittany said, her voice carrying none of the cruel confidence it had once possessed. "You look incredible. I heard you're in the Army?" "Thank you," Sarah replied simply. "Yes, I'm an Army officer, currently stationed in Washington." Brittany's eyes took in the ribbons and rank insignia on Sarah's uniform, though Sarah could tell she didn't understand their significance. "That's amazing. I always thought you were smart, but I never imagined you'd become so successful." The lie was so blatant that Sarah almost laughed. Brittany had never thought she was smart, quite the opposite, in fact. But Sarah had learned long ago that pointing out such inconsistencies served no useful purpose. People rewrote their own histories to fit their current circumstances, and there was no benefit in correcting their revised narratives. "Thank you," Sarah said again, her tone remaining polite but neutral. "I hope you're doing well, too." Before Brittany could respond, the reunion organizer called for everyone's attention. It was time for the memorial service portion of the evening, where they would honor classmates who had died since graduation. Sarah had been asked to speak about Tommy Rodriguez, and she made her way to the front of the room as the crowd settled into respectful silence. Standing behind the podium, Sarah looked out at the faces of her former classmates. Some she remembered clearly, others only vaguely, and a few not at all. They represented the cross-section of American society: teachers, business owners, parents, workers, people living ordinary lives in their hometown while she had traveled the world in service to her country. "Tommy Rodriguez was the kind of person who made everyone around him better," Sarah began, her voice carrying easily across the quiet gymnasium. "In high school, he was the guy who helped struggling classmates with their math homework, who invited the lonely kids to sit with him at lunch, who stood up for people who couldn't stand up for themselves." As she spoke about Tommy's service in Iraq and the ultimate sacrifice he had made for his country, Sarah found herself thinking about the different paths their lives had taken. Tommy had enlisted as an infantry soldier and deployed multiple times before being killed by an improvised explosive device during a patrol in Baghdad. His death had been a reminder of the price that some paid for the freedoms that others took for granted. Tommy believed in service above self, Sarah continued. He believed that we all have an obligation to contribute something meaningful to the world around us. Whether that's through military service, teaching children, caring for the sick, or simply being the kind of person who makes their community better by their presence in it. When she finished speaking, the gymnasium was completely silent for several seconds before the applause began. It started slowly, but built to a sustained ovation that went on much longer than the polite recognition she had expected. As Sarah returned to her table, she realized that something had shifted in the room. The way people looked at her had changed, as if they were seeing her clearly for the first time. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of conversations and reconnections. People who had barely acknowledged her in high school now wanted to hear about her military experiences, her travels, and her future plans. Former teachers stopped by to tell her how proud they were of her accomplishments. Even some of the parents who were attending as volunteers expressed their appreciation for her service. As the evening wound down and people began saying their goodbyes, Brittany approached Sarah one more time. This time her manner was different, less confident, more hesitant, almost apologetic. "Sarah, I was wondering if I could talk to you for a minute," Brittany said quietly. "Privately." They stepped out into the hallway, away from the noise and crowds of the gymnasium. For a moment, neither of them spoke, and Sarah found herself studying Brittany's face, looking for traces of the cruel teenager who had once made her feel so small. "I've been thinking about this all evening," Brittany began, her voice barely above a whisper. "About high school and how we treated people back then, how I treated people." She paused, seeming to struggle with what she wanted to say. "I remember that day in the locker room when you first joined ROTC. What I said to you was cruel and wrong, and I've regretted it for years." Sarah felt a moment of surprise, both at Brittany's memory of the incident and at her decision to bring it up after all these years. She had assumed that day was significant only to her, that the people who had caused her pain had forgotten about it as soon as it was over. "I was jealous of you," Brittany continued, her words coming faster now as if she was afraid she would lose her courage. "You had goals, you had direction, you knew what you wanted to do with your life. I was just drifting along, doing what everyone expected me to do, and I took out my insecurities on people who didn't deserve it. I know it's too late to change anything, but I wanted you to know that I was wrong, and I'm sorry." Sarah looked at the woman standing before her, a middle-aged mother of 3 who seemed genuinely remorseful about something she had done as a teenager. It would have been easy to respond with anger or sarcasm, to point out that her apology came only after Sarah had achieved success that demanded recognition. But looking at Brittany now, Sarah felt only a distant sadness for the person she had been and the pain she had caused herself by trying to diminish others. "Thank you for saying that," Sarah replied. "High school was a difficult time for everyone in different ways. We all made mistakes and said things we regretted. What matters is who we became afterward and how we chose to live our lives as adults." Brittany nodded, tears forming in her eyes. "You became everything you dreamed of becoming. I hope you know how proud everyone is of you, how much you've inspired people. My oldest daughter is 12 now, and I tell her about you sometimes, about how you never let anyone tell you what you couldn't do." As Sarah drove back to her hotel that night, she reflected on the unexpected turns the evening had taken. She had attended the reunion expecting to feel either vindicated or indifferent, but instead she felt something more complex, a sense of closure that she hadn't realized she needed. The next morning, before flying back to Washington, Sarah stopped by the high school one more time. It was Sunday, and the building was empty except for a maintenance worker who was cleaning up after the reunion. He recognized her uniform and thanked her for her service, then let her walk through the hallways one last time. She made her way to the gymnasium where her military journey had really begun. The decorations from the reunion were gone, and the space was back to its normal configuration. Sarah stood in the spot where Sergeant Williams had first challenged his students to discover what they were capable of achieving, and she smiled at the memory of that uncertain 17-year-old who had been so afraid of not measuring up. From her purse, Sarah pulled out the scratched flag pin she had carried for all these years. She had planned to leave it somewhere in the school as a symbolic gesture, a way of putting that part of her life to rest. But standing there in the quiet gymnasium, she realized that the pin didn't represent her insecurities or the pain she had endured. It represented her determination to prove that she belonged, her refusal to accept other people's limitations as her own. She pinned the flag to her uniform jacket where it belonged, and walked out of Lincoln High School for the last time, not as someone running from her past, but as someone who had transformed it into the foundation for everything she had achieved. Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Martinez had other battles to fight, other challenges to overcome, other barriers to break. But she would face them all with the knowledge that she had already proven the most important thing of all, that the voice inside her head was stronger than any voice that tried to tear her down, and that sometimes the people who laugh at your dreams are the ones who end up watching them come true.